Oh boy, there it goes.
And we are live.
We're gonna still not Senate transportation. Senate appropriations, we're gonna hear from Emily on the BAA that the governor released last Friday, or it was the House Appropriations Committee has been working their way through it, and we're gonna hear from Commissioner Gresham on Friday. We thought it would be good for JFO to give us a kind of one-on-one on the BAA and what to look out for. So over to you, Emily.
Sure, and so I'm not, for the record, Emily Burns, the Joint Fiscal Office. I am not going to go through a lot of the specifics on the budget adjustment that you're going to hear about on Friday from the administration. It's more appropriate that you hear from them first on what they're putting forward in the Budget Adjustment Act. This presentation is a little bit more of like, what is the budget adjustment? Why do we do it? And, you know, some things may seem obvious. It is a little, should be generally obvious, but just a sort of a reminder of the bigger context of what the budget adjustment is trying to accomplish, what it doesn't do typically, and sort of the timeline on when it should be done. So I will, there we go, share this. All right, so the Budget Adjustment Act, sometimes referred to as the BAA, is an adjustment to the current year budget. So just to sort of take a step back, right? So the governor signed the FY 2025 budget into law on May 23rd, 2024, which is about 6 weeks prior to the actual start of that budget year. The governor presented that budget to the General Assembly back on January 23rd of 2024, so 6 months prior to the start of that fiscal year. And budget instructions were released to agencies and departments back on August 31st of 2023. So that's all to say that it's been about 18 months since the start of the FY 2025 budget process. And we do the budget adjustment because things change, right? A lot evolves between the sort of beginning of that process when the governor is grabbing information from agencies and departments, and throughout the year, things change. A budget is a plan, right? A budget is how the state plans to spend its revenue, and how it estimates expenditures will be in the next fiscal year. There's a lot of assumptions that go into that budget. And a lot of those assumptions like inform what that plan is going to be, and those assumptions change over time. So one thing that changes, you probably are all familiar with Tom Kivett and Jeff Carr, the state economists. But so one of the things that changed, right? So we had our revenue assumptions when we built the budget last year. The emergency board met on July 31st of 2024, and they adopted a new revenue forecast. And that resulted in approximately $172 additional $1 million in FY25. So that additional revenue is available to be appropriated in the Budget Adjustment Act, or to be set aside and carried forward into the FY26 budget, which you will see that's part of what the administration is proposing. They're going to use some of this revenue to deal with current year challenges, but some of it's going to get carried forward into the next fiscal year to be spent in FY26. And so the emergency board is going to meet again on January 22nd, and they're going to adopt yet another revenue forecast for the current fiscal year, which will change the amount of revenue that's projected to be available in FY25, either up or down. I won't know until we all know on the 22nd. But the Budget Adjustment Act is sort of an ability to react to those changes in revenue that's available. Just as a reminder, the $172 million is for the general fund only, but they also adjusted the revenue forecast for the education fund and for the transportation fund. And so there's going to be some movement to get those budgets back into balance.
And then you want to remind us who's on the emergency board?
Yeah, so the emergency board is chaired by the governor, and then there are 4 other members who are the money chairs. So the chair of Senate and House Appropriations, Senator Perchlik is now on the emergency board, and the chair of House Ways and Means, and the chair of Senate Finance. And
the governor.
And the governor is the chair, yes. Their main job is to adopt, one of their main jobs is to adopt the revenue forecast. There are other statutory, they adopt the Medicaid caseload and utilization estimates for the coming fiscal year, do private activity bond work, and there are some other sort of reports and things that they adopt. But the sort of one that gets a lot of attention is the revenue forecast for the year, and that sort of sets the, draws the line in the sand from the revenue picture for the sort of starting of the budget building process. And additionally, in terms of the revenue picture, we have more experience with special fund receipts throughout the fiscal year. So what you will see in the budget, the Commissioner Gresham will present, the budget adjustment, the Commissioner Gresham will present on Friday, is sports betting, for example. We had some estimates around what receipts were going to be for sports betting during this fiscal year, and they're coming in less than anticipated. So we have to make an adjustment to deal with the fact that we're not getting more revenue as we anticipated. You know, counter to that, we're getting more revenue from cannabis than we thought we were going to get. So they're adjusting to reflect the additional revenue from cannabis as was compared to what was put in the budget. Additionally, things change on the expense side, right? So when we're building the budget, we're making a lot of assumptions. We're trying to look into our crystal ball and guess sort of what's going to happen on the expenditure side, right? So we have to estimate how many people will be enrolled in things like Medicaid, Reach Up, other state programs. Things like, three of you are on transportation, right? You have to make big assumptions about how much it's going to snow next year, for example, and how much plow time you need to put into the budget, how much salt there needs to be, or how much money we're going to need to spend on salt the next year. You know. And similarly, I can talk about this in the house, but right, like how much it's going to snow is going to drive how much tourism there's going to be, which is going to drive sort of revenue. So those sort of pieces we have to make assumptions about when we build the budget. How Vermonters are going to utilize government services, how many people are going to show up to actually get Medicaid services, and how much is that going to cost the state, for example. We made an assumption about whether or not there would be a flood. I think we assumed that there wouldn't be a flood this past summer, and there was a flood. So now we have to react in the budget adjustment to that. There's assumptions about what's going to happen in the economy, what unemployment was going to be, what the sort of changes in prices will be. Things like the price of gas is built into the budget when we first build it, and then we learned that it's probably going to be different than what we thought it was going to be, and that impacts transportation and public safety and Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's the cost in state employee benefits. So in the budget adjustment, you'll hear about the state employee healthcare costs and how they're, it's looking like it's more expensive than we thought it was going to be. So they're making some adjustments to try to deal with overspending in the state employee benefit plan. There's assumptions about the rate of inflation, right? It's anybody's best guess what the Fed is going to do to try to adjust, to try to impact the rate of inflation and what's sort of happening in the economy around that. And that impacts everything, you know, expenditures throughout state government. And there's lots of things, lots of assumptions that are in, right? So we use those assumptions and estimates, and a lot of times we're wrong. And I think the sort of like to compare people who build budgets to weathermen, right? Like we do our best, we use the data that we have that's available, but at the end of the day, it's our best guess, right? Or estimate.
Actually, you're not, a lot of the time we're all pretty close.
We're close,
unless,
yeah.
unless it really, unless a recession comes. And if a recession comes, then you get huge swings, and then there's a lot of difference. But for the most part, the economists are pretty good, and the process that we've developed to do the human services caseload is pretty good through all of it, and the adjustments we make are really minor. People do a really good job.
Yeah.
But when you get to a recession, the income tax and the swings that come with that can be huge, and they really hurt.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. We do a pretty good job, right? It's really that sort of on that margin, that like a couple $1 million a year. I will say that the budget adjustment is about $110 million worth of adjustments, which is a pretty big budget adjustment.
I was gonna say, it is, but as a percentage, it's still small.
It's still small, yeah.
$10 million is a lot of money.
There's a lot of money, and a lot of that is actually, a lot of the challenges are in the Medicaid program. So we'll let Finance and Management and Department of Vermont Health Access talk about that, but there are some cost pressures in healthcare, right? Medicaid is a health insurance program, and
There's some big ones in nursing homes in Franklin County.
Yeah.
And they just had that home health agency that went bankrupt after 100 years. Ouch.
Very ouch.
Yeah. So I just sort of, quickly, I sort of said all of this already, but flying through some of these expenditures, you have more or fewer people enrolled in those programs than we thought in the budget. It snowed more or less than we thought it was going to. More or fewer Vermonters went and utilized services than we anticipated. There was a flood, for example. Something happened in the economy that we didn't anticipate. The price of gas is different than we assumed. The employee health care costs went up more or less than we anticipated. The rate of inflation was different than we assumed, right? Sort of all of these things can be different. And when we get to budget adjustment, the sort of magnitude of those changes, right? And whether or not the budget can handle the sort of ups and downs, or whether or not it requires a legislative modification to the budget is what the budget adjustment does. So there are other sort of terms or things that you may hear about the budget adjustment that are technical. So for example, receipts aren't meeting projections. I alluded to this related to sports betting, right? We made an assumption about what the revenues were going to be there, and they're not coming in, so now we have to make an adjustment. The cost per case is increasing and decreasing. I think this is what we'll hear in the Medicaid budget, is that it's not actually there are more people showing up for Medicaid, it's that the cost per person is going up. The healthcare is just costing more. Again, projections were not met. An example of this that you'll see in the budget adjustment is there's an adjustment, a decrease in the amount of money available for the new child care programs, and that's that there are fewer people signing up for child care services than was anticipated in the budget, so there's some savings there. Unable to hire staff, sometimes you hear that in state government, right? We thought we were gonna set up a program and we were gonna have everybody hired by X date, and we've had trouble hiring those people, so the results, there's savings in the budget there. And sort of vice versa, that also happens elsewhere. You'll see in the budget with the Human Rights Commission, right? They assumed that they would have a certain level of vacancy savings, right? And you hear about vacancy savings a lot. And that might be a good thing to come talk about sort of what vacancy savings is at another date. But the Human Rights Commission assumed that they would have some vacancy savings in their budget. And turns out that they have been fully staffed and anticipate being fully staffed for the remainder of the fiscal year, which means their budget, assuming that vacancy savings doesn't have the capacity to fully pay all their people. So they need a budget adjustment to make sure they have enough spending authority to cover everybody's anticipated salaries. Another thing that we often hear about the budget adjustment is a project started late, right? We assumed it was going to start by October 1, and for whatever reason, maybe there was a flood and resources had to get diverted accordingly. Some sort of project isn't going to start at the same timeline, and there may be savings associated with that. The vacancy savings one is a good example of this one. The savings weren't realized, right? Anticipated some savings in the budget, and it just didn't work out that way. So they weren't able to save the money they anticipated. A lot of times when you build a budget, you have to make assumptions about requests for proposal that's going to go out for a contract or grant. And maybe when you put that RFP out into the marketplace, it turns out that all the bids are higher than you anticipated, or you have some bids that come in lower than you thought they were going to be. So then you have to adjust your budget accordingly. A lot of times in the budget adjustment, there are transactions that are labeled as net neutral transactions. We do our best to get all of the spending into the correct appropriations, but sometimes we put them in the wrong place. So I know in the budget adjustment this year, there's one of those net neutral transactions within the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, where we appropriated money to the administration division of Agency of Commerce and Community Development, but the money should have gone to the Department of Economic Development, I believe. So that just moves $500,000, or I can't remember the exact number, between those two line items. So those transactions often show up in the budget adjustment. Another one that you'll hear about is this SLA, stands for Service Level Agreement, which is an arrangement with a department or agency and the Agency of Digital Services for the purchase of IT equipment or some sort of IT services. And it would probably be good once we hear from finance and management to sort of ask them about this and potentially have the Agency of Digital Services in to come speak about this. But several agencies and departments have increases in the budget adjustment related specifically to the service level agreements with the Agency of Digital Services and IT that was purchased on behalf of those agencies and departments that they now need to reimburse ADS for that weren't sort of anticipated in the original budget. And I already spoke about vacancy savings that weren't realized. So all of those sort of things can be swirling in the current year budget, right? Things change, we make our best estimates. Sometimes we're wrong. Sometimes we're close, we're very close, but wrong just enough that we need to have a budget adjustment act. Referred to BAA, the last A being the act itself, which is technically not an act for a while, but we still call it the BAA. So budget adjustment acts, the mid fiscal year opportunity to make updates to the current fiscal year budget. Chance to both appropriate unforeseen revenues and address unplanned expenses. I should probably put the contrary on there also to deal with if revenue comes in lower than anticipated to make our adjustments accordingly to bring the budget back into balance. So the budget adjustment is really meant to be a technical adjustment to the appropriations, sort of based on new information. It's really not meant to be a policy bill. There's sort of other mechanisms for making big changes to policy. So it's really meant to be just technical adjustments.
People will try to do that because it's a must-pass bill, and so people will want to add things that are policy, like a new program, but it really should go through the whole bill process.
And I think there have been times in the past where things need to go quickly and they end up in the budget adjustment, but that's sort of a bigger, as long as
Budget
it's a
adjustment,
bigger conversation.
but the budget's a good place for some.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Yeah. And so one thing that you'll see, and we can walk through the letter of intent after I get through this presentation, I'm almost done with it, but there's a letter of intent that often goes out. So the budget, once it passes the General Assembly, we try to make it as perfect as possible, but sometimes there are things that aren't specifically clear to the administration in terms of what they need to do. So the chairs of the appropriations committees often will draft a letter of intent that is given to the administration to just provide clarity and additional information on like what we meant here was, and then please present that in the Budget Adjustment Act, and then we'll incorporate it accordingly.
And it's drafted by GFO. And
yes, we help.
The chair sign
it. Yes, with input from everybody.
Yeah.
So we can go through those. Once I go through the timeline, we can go back to the letters of intent. But the timeline, so it's typically presented early in the legislative session because it impacts spending that's happening today, right now. So Commissioner Gresham presented it to the House on Friday.
And I think the House said they want to have it, maybe that's in your timeline, they want to have it passed by the 3rd of February?
Yes, they have ambitious goals to finish it by, I think, the end of the month, if they can, to get it out of committee by the end of the month, but we'll see what happens. I think one thing to sort of flag generally for the committee, and one thing that's maybe different from some of the budgets that I've worked on in the past, is that it's happened in the last year's budget, and it will happen again, and maybe the couple budgets before that, but with the extra revenue that's come through in the emergency board process and the adoption of the new revenue forecast, there has been a desire to use some of the money, the current year money, and carry it forward into the next fiscal year, which means that the budget adjustment and the budget themselves are linked together. So you have to see sort of what's being spent in the current year and what's being held off and then used in the budget. And then it's important to kind of see both things happening. So I think how quickly the House moves will kind of depend on what the anticipated use of that money that's being carried forward is into the next fiscal year and how they sort of interact with each other. So the budget adjustment is typically one of the first bills to pass the General Assembly. One thing to just note, it's not the last time that the General Assembly adjusts the current year budget typically. So the budget adjustment will be the first big pass at it, but then in the big bill itself, in the C sections, which Grady is going to come and kind of walk through the difference between each section, but the C section is always dedicated to adjustments to the current year budget in next year's budget. So there may, as we get more information, as we get closer to the end of the fiscal year, if we get to April, and that's when we find out whether or not personal income tax is going to hit its forecast or not. And like last year, we learned that it was going to definitely exceed its targets, and that's when sort of development of, okay, so if it's going to exceed its targets, what do we want to do? That's where the sort of contingency list comes in, and those are sort of adjustments to the current year budget. That's all I had on this. So I don't know if there are any questions on the BAA generally, or I can do a quick walkthrough of the letter of intent, just so you know in the back of your head what to anticipate from finance and management. let's say this will work.
Last year, we had to do a second letter of intent, and we had to do an addendum, or is that the addendum was already there to show the numbers?
We had to do an addendum because there was another issue that came up, that we didn't catch the first go around. But it was, not to be like, we did a good job, but it was a short letter of intent, which means we all did a great job last year. There's Zoom. So this was the first letter of intent issued last year, right before the start of the fiscal year that it impacted. The first one, and you'll hear about this one, I don't need to take specific testimony on it, but there was a change to the appropriation for the Agency of Digital Services. And you'll notice right here, the reduction was supposed to be $873,856, but the 3 got dropped, so the reduction was only $87,000. So in the budget, this was instructing that yes, in the Budget Adjustment Act, we will fix that for the accidental removal of a digit, and all will be well.
That could be.
So you can't fix it with the letter of intent, it's just like, we're gonna fix that in the budget adjustment.
Yeah.
Even though it was clearly a keystroke error.
Yes, and that was one that we had talked with John Bloomer and Betsy Ann about and said, it's clearly we missed the digit, and like, nope, the legislature appropriated this amount of money, you gotta wait and adjust it in the budget adjustment process. So that will appear, and it is for the internal service fund, the Agency of Digital Service, so it didn't, doesn't put the general fund out of balance, doesn't mess with any of that, it's really just sort of technical thing. The next one was related to the contingent appropriation list that was in the FY25 budget. So there was $114 million of contingencies that were listed. One of the questions that came up that wasn't, the finance and management wanted specific clarity on was if the amount of extra revenue was less than the list of the contingent list, was it the intent of the General Assembly to either go down the list and then stop? Or was the intent to take the list and take the amount of money available and prorate it accordingly? And the answer was no, go down the list until it's done, and to fund, so and if it was a partial amount of funding, so if you get to item number 11 and it's a $5 million line item and there's only $2 million, to do $2 million instead of the 5. So that was just clarifying that that was the intent.
And like,
go down
when this was sent out?
June 28th.
June.
So right before
a good month and a half after we left.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, it turned out.
Those conversations.
Some of them, but like,
It wasn't specific in the language, so they wanted.
It wasn't specific in the language, but we had those conversations in the conference committee.
Yes, and I think that's the letter of intent, right? Like there are conversations in committee, there are testimony, sort of everybody's on the same page of like, yes, this was the intent, even though it's not explicit. This ended up kind of becoming moot because there was more than $114 million worth of additional revenue at the end of the fiscal year. So they got through the list and then ended up.
Emily, do you want to remind us, if you have on top of your head, what happens if we have excess revenue and we don't have a contingency?
Yes, so if there's excess revenue by statute, 50% of the excess revenue in the fiscal year goes to the general fund balance reserve, which is one of the reserves in the general fund. And 50% is split between the state employees' pension and the teachers' pension or OPEB, both.
They both go to the pension.
They both go to the pension systems.
How much did we end up with?
I can't remember, was it 14 million?
I think each system about 8.7.
8.7, so I think it was, yeah, about 14 went to the reserves, 14 to the pensions, and then it got split. I'll pull the actual number for you. But yeah, that's what ends up happening with those funds. So, there was a Superior Court Justice position added at the judiciary, and it was supposed to be funded with the tobacco settlement funds. And the idea is that that position is funded with the tobacco settlement funds until it is exhausted, and then as part of the budget process, come back and ask for something other than the tobacco settlement funds to fund that position. Which I don't know if that will be part of the 26 budget, but it will come once they exhaust that funding stream. At the end of the fiscal year, there was sort of reversion of $3 million of unobligated funds from the Department of Children and at the Agency of Human Services to go to the Child Welfare Information System, sometimes referred to as CCWIS. And this is that the amount of that reversion should be immediately appropriated back to the Department of Children and Families to kind of keep them whole for that change. There was a rate increase for the designated agencies in the FY25 budget. This was to clarify that it was the intent that that 3% rate increase wasn't specifically for employee salaries, that it was to recognize that the sort of overall costs of work at the designated agencies had gone up, and then it was sort of the designated agencies who decided how much went to salaries versus how much went to other cost pressures and increases that are going on at the designated agencies. That one page was all of the sort of letter of intent related to the budget itself. There was also some clarification that was needed for H687, which turned into, I believe, Act 181, which related to some of the changes in the property transfer tax. And this you will see in the budget adjustment that Commissioner Gresham will present on Friday. But there was an issue around the property transfer tax is off, the statutory allocations of the property transfer tax is often not withstood within the Budget Act, and what's dedicated to the general fund versus municipal regional planning commissions. I can't remember the third one. Anyway,
Yeah.
however that's dedicated gets not withstood, and they dedicate, and it's allocated differently than what's in statute. In Act 181 last year, that was sort of modified, and there was a timing issue around when, the budget went, and then Act 181 had its process, and making sure that there was alignment to make sure that we didn't kind of mess up the budget, or what the sort of budgetary numbers needed to be with what happened with what Act 181. And one of the issues is that the budget, we had it all lined up, but then the effective date of Act 181 was actually before the budget. So then there was sort of conflicting language around that. So the budget adjustment is going to clear up what I believe was the intent, right? Which is that what happened in Act 181 is sort of where it should have ended, not go back to the budget after Act 181. So that will clean that up, and this just sort of outlines for the administration that that was the intent, is to follow that. And to make sure that the appropriations, there were some appropriations in Act 181 that didn't make it all the way through, and that those needed to get trued up in the budget. And this other one on Section 96 of Act 181, there was an appropriation to the Vermont State Housing Authority. An important thing to remember as an appropriator is that we only appropriate money to state entities. And the Housing Authority doesn't get direct appropriations from the state. The State Housing Authority gets its money from the state through a state agency or department. So this was this will be in the budget adjustment, but this is to adjust so that $2.5 million goes to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and then they develop a grant or contract with the Housing Authority to get them that money. So
Even though they're like an instrumentality.
They're an instrumentality, but they're not one that receives appropriations. BHCB receives appropriations.
VITA?
But I think like and BHFA might, but not the Housing Authority. So there's certain entities that do. I should probably have that list for you so you know. But the Housing Authority gets some grants through state government.
Like the Vermont Symphony Orchestra, that's not like we give direct appropriations.
They get a direct appropriation.
They're not a part of the state.
They are not part of the state.
They should be.
Well, actually, none of the higher ed pieces are directly parts of the state government.
They are, and they're more quasi-state government.
But they aren't part of the retirement system.
No.
They're and they get direct appropriations outside of.
So we don't give appropriations to non-government entities except when we do.
Yeah. Well, and I think the colleges and the UVM, I'm not a lawyer, I should probably keep my mouth shut. But they are, from like an accounting perspective, they are considered sort of part of state government. I'll go talk to the lawyers about the details. I'll get back to you.
And when they do the books, you know, they don't audit any of those entities.
No.
They're off.
Yeah. So then a couple other things that were in that bill that we needed to, you know, put some intent around. I think there was an error about striking an appropriation to Commerce about the manufactured home improvement program. So the intent was to make sure that language went in and not remove the prior appropriations that were erroneously struck. And then the effective date issue that I talked about, that the timing of the effective dates was problematic from the budget perspective, so we needed to clean
And
that up.
Emily, does this letter hold any actual weight? Or is it just almost like a list of things to remember and what we're hoping the next legislature do? I'm assuming over the years, there's been a time when the following legislature has, for whatever reason, decided not to follow a direction of the intent letter, right?
Probably, and this is another, I'm not the lawyer.
What the intent, what?
Better reliance better.
Well,
Oh,
yes,
sorry.
when we do intent in LCAR, it's critically important in case there's a challenge, a court challenge. So this would serve as evidence in a challenge that this is what we were meant to do.
Right.
I'm not a lawyer either, so you better
Yeah.
double check.
The intent document has historically, from my point of view, been a document that was particularly for the administration to make it clear what the legislative intent was to the appropriated body. So and if they go outside of that then there's a document the legislature can say to the administrators, we told you what we meant.
And
I
I
like
think,
that one better.
Because they will ask, they'll say, that if we pass the bill, they'll read something and they're like, can you put this in your letter of intent, because we're not sure.
Or they don't want the letter of intent because they want to interpret it the way they want to interpret it. And we're clear, and that makes it clear what we meant.
and it is not the law, right? So, and
No,
it is,
no.
I think it's that issue where, you know,
No.
like the House passes we have from when the House to the Senate to the conference committee to make adjustments, right? And they happen along the way based on feedback from the administration, but once it's done, it's done. And, you know, to have to wait, they've got to start executing the budget that you put forward. And if there are questions, they don't want to, if there are questions on how they should execute it, this letter of intent kind of gives them some more guidance so they can start working on stuff, or they can allocate money appropriately. And then it can get caught up in the budget adjustment if specific language is necessary. So then there was in H 887, which I believe was the yield bill. Yes, related to property tax yield. That would be the yield bill. Related to, there was a sort of an overpayment and some issues with payments to a couple of school districts. And there was language in that bill to try to fix it. And it didn't quite get fixed enough. So it's in the Budget Adjustment Act again to get updated again. And I think that was everything that was in the letter of intent. The first one, there was a second one. I can pull that one up really quick. There was only one issue in the second letter of intent.
And does the governor and the VA often include these items, even they were the legislative letter of intent, they put them in there?
Yeah.
For us, kind of.
Yeah. They put them in there, and then it's like pretty clear in all of their supporting documentation, right, per the letter of intent, or to align with the letter of intent. Sure, I'm sharing the right one. Yes, July 24th. So this one came to our attention in July. We had a lot of conversations about this one, but this was an issue with the allocation of the opioid settlement funds. It's actually easier to look at the actual language. So there was an appropriation made, and there was a question about sort of how many entities this was supposed to go to, and there were, and like whether or not there was a second satellite location. And I think that it wasn't supposed to be that the first $1.5 million was supposed to be divided by 4, and then an additional $500,000 went to the one operated by the Howard Center. It was that that everybody would get $500,000. And that wasn't explicitly, it's not clear by the original language that was appropriate, that was written. So this clarifies that the first 1.5 gets divided between the three, and then the other remaining $500,000 goes to that satellite location, in Chittenden County. So that clarifies that, and that's in the Budget Adjustment Act, as well.
I remember going over that language. I think we would have gotten it right. Remember we talked about
Yeah, we
it.
worked hard on that too, yeah.
But that got figured out in July, and then this letter of intent went out to help the health department make sure that they allocated these grants, correctly.
But even though it's not the law, they based it on that letter, not on the bill.
On that letter and Jane saying so.
Yeah.
Seriously,
Yeah.
I imagine she got a lot of deference that we'll have to, we'll have to.
Build up somehow.
Yeah. exactly.
Well, the intent letter is both chairs
Yep.
signing, and usually, everybody that is on the conference committee takes a look. So you usually have a lot of eyes, and you come back to an appropriations committee after you've had a letter of intent and interpret something completely different. It is
Very bad.
you're looking at somebody in the next budget, making it explicit what they not wanted.
Mhm.
Well, one of the people that signed that isn't here. You know, because there's an election.
Two of them.
I mean, two now here, yeah, both of them.
But clearly, we have the documents, so if the legislature said, this is the way, the likelihood of not getting called into a policy committee and having it come up at this table is not great.
That's all I had specifically, unless you have any questions on budget adjustment. I think once Commissioner Gresham presents and the department's gonna have lots of conversations about what to do with it.
Details. Maybe, can you quickly share your screen and show us where the budget adjustment, because the documents are all up on your website. If we wanted to pre-game the budget adjustment by reading the document.
Yes, that I did jump back into the meeting.
Chris, can you turn on the light?
Oh, would there be a light?
That's-
Okay.
Feels much less furtive now.
Alright, and then,
Is that your gov ops?
Was that?
Is that your gov ops?
Could be.
So at some point in time, not today, but we're going to go to vacancy savings.
Usually we could have a talk about vacancy savings in general, or each department, when they come in there, they'll have a vacancy savings in there, and often it comes up, it's like, wow, that's a big vacancy savings, or, but if you want to talk about it as a budget item, we can do that in committee as well.
yeah, I'm happy to come and speak, like, why, there's a lot of conversations about it, but what is it, and why does it exist, and what does it mean?
Why does it become controversial?
Why is it controversial? Yeah, I'm happy to do a quick 15 minutes on that at some point if you want. So where do you find the budget document? So Grady came and gave you the tour,
Yeah.
right, earlier today, right? So if you go into subjects, right, appropriations and budget, if you want to find it on the JFO website, I believe it's also going to be on the committee website once Commissioner Gresham's here. But if you want to find it on our website, we're talking about FY25, and then right at the top will be the governor's budget adjustment proposal. And then as Short Grady went through this, right, as sort of each iteration of the budget adjustment happens, the House proposal will be there, and then the Senate proposal, and then the conference committee, and then the final will sort of build on top of it.
And then, do you want to open one of those? It's like the opening statement is a Word document, but that there's not much in there.
Oh, this one is
no,
the operating statement. This one might have an answer to Senator Brennan's question. Yeah, so $17 million,
Yeah.
and I know Chris already told you, but
Yeah.
in case anybody else wants to know.
Let's see if he was right, though.
At the end, so this is the FY24 final position at the end of the fiscal year. This transferred to the balance reserve rainy day fund. So this was the revenue and over and above the contingency list. So there was $17 million, which is 50% of what was left. So I don't do math.
So the opening letter is,
35 million bucks.
opening letter is just always on one page, right? It's like the BA on one page.
This, yeah, the operating statement, right? This is sort of like where everything,
Shook out.
all the revenues that came in, all the expenditures that went out, all the transfers that happened, and then sort of what moved into the reserves. We haven't been as good about doing it, like about getting our operating statement out there, but JFO, that's on my list of things to do more of. But this is finance and management's one. So there was 17 million to the balance reserve, and then the other 50% split equally between the state employees retirement fund and the teachers post-retirement allowance account of 8.8 million at the end of last year. But this actually, I'd like to quickly point out on here. So this net reserves down here, this $87 million, this is what the administration is proposing to be reserved in FY 2025 to carry forward to be available in FY 26.
You lost me there. To be carried forward, to be used?
Presumably in the FY 26 budget, we will see the expenditure of that. So they are holding it in FY 25.
Okay.
Carrying it into next year.
And that's the sum total of the reserves?
The sum total of the reserve, this is just a sort of, reserve might not be the right term for it, but they're holding it
A wish list?
just for
It's like a special reserve.
it's kind of it's a one-time thing for FY 25. So when they got, approximately $172 million of additional revenue at the emergency board meeting,
I see. So
they spend about 110. There's
so
more in and outs, but
that's just sitting there to be used.
yes, this is like
I
a
thought
lot
it
of
was the
lines.
total of all of the reserve funds.
No, that's down here. This 414 million is the
Okay.
total of all the reserves. So there's about 120 in the stabilization reserve, all those other ones.
Sarah Watson?
Yeah, so it's not subject to this other, policy about, 50% goes to the, reserves and then.
Correct.
Pensions is the
Yeah.
other.
There's,
This is separate from that.
yes, so they have the proposed language in the governor's budget adjustment is that sort of notwithstanding the normal allocation of funds at the end of the year, hold that money in the general fund and bring it forward to next year to be utilized.
And then if you just quickly open the other documents, just compare what we're gonna see.
What you're
from
gonna
the
see, yeah, that
administration.
would be good.
The worksheet has a lot of fine print, yeah.
Yes, the worksheet, you'll get it printed bigger. But this is a sort of overview of everything. So across the top is what got passed in each fund, and then each line item, and it's broken down by sort of area of government, so sort of section of the bill, and then by fund across the top. So what the changes are to each of those funds. And then all the way to the right is kind of an explanation of what's going on. So this is a good thing, potentially to look at before Friday. And yeah, so it's broken down by.
So everything's in here, even if it's not adjusted, like judiciary, 2.5 million, 2.5 million. You would go through and see if there's any numbers between the middle columns, basically.
Yeah, well, these are just adjustments. So the only departments that are listed here are ones that they're proposing to make adjustments to.
Oh, right, because that's just, I get it.
Yeah, so this is we'll use the judiciary line. They're proposing to add $2.5 million to the judiciary's budget. And then it goes through all of the.
The narrative will give you the details.
Yeah, and then the departments will give you more details when they come in. But there are, at the bottom, when you get through the whole thing, there's also some one-time appropriations at the very bottom. They're putting forward. And then there's some changes to the other acts. I think we talked about some of those things. And then some transfers and reversions. So transfers are from the general fund into another fund, or from the general fund, from other funds into the general fund. And then reversions are prior year appropriations that aren't gonna be utilized, so they are taking money back from a prior year and moving it, making it available in this current year. Here's the sports wagering thing I mentioned at the time, so this is adjusting that estimate. They're gonna be about $860,000 less than they thought, and that's all of it. So the total, general fund changes here are about 85 million, on the general fund.
More than.
Yeah.
The last document.
The last one is the language. And they will go through the language as well, I think, and they will mention this. So the first 35 pages of language is just, when you see the budget adjustment document, the sort of first part of the budget, the actual bill, the first part of it is sort of crossing out the initial appropriations and then reappropriate, establishing the new appropriations. So they have in this document put all of they sort of restated all of the sections that are going to change. And then they have little explanations that are similar to what's in that, the big spreadsheet. And so the first 30 pages or so is just a restatement of all of those number changes. So then you got to go all the way to, where is it? Page, I said 30 pages. Hopefully I'm not making anybody sick by doing this.
Yeah, looks like on page 39, maybe it's.
Yeah, it's about at section 50. So this is a good example. So we talked about in the letter of intent, the changes that needed to be made to the property transfer tax. So these number changes are aligning everything with what happened in Act 181. And then from here is sort of where it starts to go into more changes to language. So we have the list of changes in the transfers from special fund to or from the general fund to other funds or the transportation fund. These are just the explanations. Yeah, and they do a nice job of giving explanations to sort of all of those changes. There's a bunch of reversions. So again, prior year appropriations that are being pulled back into the general fund. I think it's about an additional $19 million worth of reversions. From the general fund, and then there are some education fund reversions in here. Money that goes to reserves, probably don't need to go through all the positions, and then it really just gets into more,
So when the administration presented this in the House, I think they were there for 4.5 hours or 5.5 hours.
Mm-hmm.
We're not gonna have them do that much in here, so we'll have them here. I think we scheduled a couple hours.
2 hours.
To go through all this.
They've got less to do.
Yeah.
And more time to do it.
Right.
If you do look at it beforehand,
You'll hear
then
many
come
more
with
of these
questions
times.
for the administration. And you can also talk to Emily or Amy about questions. If you see something in the budget adjustment documents, it's helpful to go to them and ask those questions.
It's a good thing Dick Sears isn't here, then you would have heard even worse.
I'm sure I will. Oh, yeah.
Okay, any other questions for Emily? Right, issue Emily?
Thanks, Emily.
So we're gonna just have Elle go over our committee website real quick, and then we can end early.
Next. I hate that when that happens.
And I will say that when I was setting up that, Senator Ruth had mentioned that we were gonna have Julia talk about education fund appropriations next week, but it's really tomorrow.
Ah, okay.
Well, the next Thursday was this Thursday.
Fine with me.
Even better. All right, well, this is pretty simple. So this is the regular General Assembly website. And if you're looking for our committee, you can ask this little search bar. It has both House and Senate right there. So if you were wondering what they're doing ahead of you, you can always go and check out their website.
Launch their videos. You could go home and then watch all House appropriations.
Nice.
And so this is your page. If you are ever looking for the official agenda, it's right there where it says agenda.
If you don't have access to the chalkboard, that is.
Correct. And then down here, we have all of the documents that are come through from all of the different areas. I think that one of the most important ones to look at here is other documents. So here is where all of those things will live. We don't have anything in here yet because there isn't anything to put in there yet. However, we do have stuff here, so I can show you that. So this is all the stuff that you have seen from the JFO during their orientation. So if you wanted to go back and look at Amy's, you can go and find it here. So when you come in for any day, you can find this here that day. So as long as they give it to me ahead of time, which they're supposed to, it will be up here before you come to your meeting so that you can click on it and have it on your laptops or on your iPads if you're interested in doing that. To the left here, we have some additional information. There usually isn't very much in here, but
That's where, if you don't have your sheet about what budget assignments is, that's where it is on the website.
and the House one's there too, but I did email it to y'all and I also put it up on that board, so it's in many places. I'm just gonna show you last year so you can see a little bit more kind of what these things look like, because it's helpful. So let's say we go on FY20. So that's what those folders look like. And then if you were to click through those folders, you would find the documents that are associated with them. Grady said you guys can look through this witness list, and that is obviously an option for y'all if that's the easiest way for you to do it.
Who it is,
Yep, and same thing with reports and resources, though there's not usually very much in here, I found out. House has less than. I think really that's all I have. Do you guys have questions about what your committee page looks like?
or anything that you would want to have on the page?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe some videos.
There is, if you wanted to show anybody, there is a link to our YouTube on the committee page.
Yeah, so
I'll
yeah,
give you a
you
look,
can,
it's like-
it says watch on live stream right here, so you can always click this and it will take you to our YouTube.
The bottom is
Right here.
real.
But sometimes I send that
After.
to constituents.
There we go. Yeah, so you can always click it from here, or if you go to the agenda, there's the live stream.
Saved.
And you want.
Oh, good for
And then for,
Appropriations.
on the, when you
Got
post
it
it,
as
like if somebody sends you a
pages now.
presentation
Yep.
the night before,
Yeah.
because I'm gonna be in
That's
appropriations the next day,
Judiciary.
you don't post it that night.
It
And you
depends on
go-
how late it comes in.
you could,
I'm not
zoom
necessarily
in
working
to the
from
meeting.
home at 7, but if it comes in at 7, I'll.
One
do it in the
man-
morning.
I would rather that
Month.
it gets posted closer to the time, because I wouldn't want it to be out to the public a lot of time ahead of the time that the senators.
Sure do.
Luckily, I put in the
Accurate.
date that the person's actually coming, so it does not go on the website until that date,
Right.
even if I do it ahead of time.
Okay, assuming there's no questions about that.
No.
All right.
All right, well, if you need me for anything, if you have any questions that come up that you didn't think of now, you can, always ask. I'm here, always.
Well, that, we will adjourn for the day.
Thank you.